Hey guys, it's the Line Podcast. Matt Gurney and Jen Gerson back at it once more. Michael Ma, China, new problem for Carney over forced labor. All right, Air Canada CEO versus Quebec. I'm betting on Quebec, but we'll see about that. Also, Polyev goes to America. So does Jen. Only one of them gets a White House invite. It's the Line Podcast. You know, you and I have been beating up on the conservatives for a while, and we've been unimpressed.
Sorry, guys.
But you know who's having an amazing Friday?
He's having an amazing Friday.
The conservatives. Because Michael Ma, who was a conservative MP until he defected to the Liberals, in a committee meeting, I think it was yesterday, this week, I think it was yesterday though, took on Margaret McQuaid Johnston, who is a long-serving, very credible Canadian expert on security issues, intelligence, and geopolitics and human rights issues.
In China
took her
specifically.
on pardon me?
In China specifically. She's a China expert. She's a China hand.
And took her on in a committee meeting.
Undermining her credentials, trying to make her look like an idiot. And doing this to raise, I think, questions about forced labor practices in China, to make it her look like she was.
So you say there's forced labor. Have you ever been there?
Yeah, exactly.
Have you ever seen it yourself?
Kind of thing.
Well, Mr. Ma, I never saw the Nazis forcing Jews into ovens. But
pretty convinced it happened. There's some good, compelling evidence. Look, I think there's some background that I think people should be aware of on both sides of this particular coin here. So I actually talked to McQuaid Johnston just before we started the Line podcast. I've known her for a number of years. Talked with her about China for a number of years. She has been going to China regularly since like 1979 and basically had to stop going when China kidnapped the two Michaels, because this was the point at which she started to get nervous about visiting China. She was sanctioned by China in 2024 for the work that she was doing on drawing attention to forced labor at Uyghur labor camps. So she is known by Beijing as being a fierce and vocal critic of Beijing. So there's that you should be aware of, understanding the backstory of this particular committee meeting. Michael Ma, you may recall, was elected as a Conservative Party MP, but very controversial. I think he was the first to cross the floor after the last election to the Liberal Party. And I do recall that there was a really interesting piece by Sam Cooper raising kind of speculative questions about the degree to which Beijing influence may have been a factor in his decision to cross the floor. And Sam Cooper, in his article about this for the Bureau, his Substack a few months ago, said, look, there is no direct evidence that shows that Michael Ma is an agent of Beijing or is unduly influenced by Beijing. It's just, the riding he's running in. There's been lots of history of sort of diaspora internal politics around Beijing. And there were some questions raised. And, our take on the line was, if Sam Cooper says there is no direct evidence, then there's no direct evidence. So that's kind of the place that we have to work from, right?
Coop knows that beat better than we do.
But Coop knows that beat better than we do. But I will say that if we don't know whether or not Michael Ma is an agent of Beijing, I think that our way of phrasing this would be, we're not entirely sure how his behavior would be any different if it were.
Yeah.
Is that the way we can say that?
Let me give the lawyer-friendly version of that statement. Neither myself nor Jen Gerson nor the Line Inc. has any knowledge of whatever links, if any, Mr. Ma may have to the regime in Beijing. That being said, what Mr. Ma did in Parliament this week at the committees is pretty much verbatim what I would think someone who does have links to Beijing would do. And it's 100% possible. It's a coincidence. It could be a matter of profound personal conviction on Mr. Ma's part. But if we did have someone in the parliament who was running Chinese talking points, they'd sound like what he said. The idea that we as a nation or as our parliamentarians are going to be skeptical about human rights issues in China in the face of evidence that we've accumulated, that our allies have accumulated, and that very reputable third-party organizations that specialize in human rights abuses have accumulated, is now to be thrown in Margaret's face as a gotcha moment. Okay. I don't know what Mr. Ma's motives are, but I know what they look like.
Well, there you go. And then, of course, this particularly testy exchange at committee managed to find its way to state TV, of course, highly truncated in order to make McQuaig-Johnson look discredible.
In China,
so this
Chinese
was
state TV?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So interesting, right? Interesting. So let's there's the internal petty drama here. I think this presents enormous problems for Mark Carney. We know, we're going to zoom back out of here. We know that in the face of, how should I say this, changes in American policy toward allies in the Western Hemisphere, Canada has chosen to try and re-engage with China and other types of allies not necessarily allies, but potentially quasi-hostile powers, including China, in order to regain some, for lack of a better term, control, sovereignty, or leverage against the Americans. That is now well established, understandable, and you and I have remained uncomfortable with this because at this one hand, we're not naive about China, and we're not experts on China, but we're not naive about China. But we're also not naive about the Americans. So we're kind of like between a rock and a hard place and happy with none of this. But at the same time, what you have here is a liberal party that is trying to be taken seriously as someone who can navigate some very tricky waters and some very fine little tightropes. Now I'm mixing my metaphors here. While at the same time, a recent floor crosser MP to the Liberal Party is acting uncomfortably in alignment with the regime that doesn't really love it when people point out their forced labor practices.
Yeah.
And I'm going to get McQuaig-Johnson on the line, hopefully this week or next, to talk a little bit about the backstory and the history and forced labor in Uyghur China, as that seems to be a topic that is now going to be Streisand affected strongly in Canada. And God bless her for it. But yeah, I don't love where we are, Matt. I don't love this.
I think the way you've articulated it is actually excellent.
Oh, good. We all know that I'm not necessarily a natural radio host. I sort of live in the written for a reason, Lots of ums and ahs.
It's not the ums and ahs that worry me. I think Carney is, objectively speaking, between a rock and a hard place. Mm-hmm. And it's not just practical and pragmatic, although it is. It's also political, because he has to balance the political necessity of not seeming complicit or subservient to the Americans with the reality of our military and economic links or dependence, bluntly, with them. He also needs to balance pragmatically and politically the urgent desire to diversify our trade and counterbalance an increasingly unpredictable America. But he has to do it in a way that does not cause any more problems. And I think people are going to be mad at him or they're going to support him, whatever. I'm not actually being either right now. I'm just trying to lay out the problem as I see it. This is the problem set that the prime minister has. One of the things that I hate, but it's just the reality of it, is that in recent years, Canada has not had good relations with China and India, which are the two easiest, most logical countries to make some kind of a pivot to if you want to decouple yourselves from America. Mm-hmm. And you and I talked about this, I think it was last month, maybe earlier this month. I don't know. It's all blurring together. But the liberals couldn't figure out what the hell they were going to say about India. They had no idea. Like, they could not get their act together on that one. They could not come up with a coherent talking point that acknowledged the obvious, which is that we're pivoting to work with a regime that we don't like very much because we have to. Like, and if they weren't politicians, they could just say that. They could say exactly that, but they are, so they can't. And now with China, we have, the liberals and Mr. Carney in a very similar situation. But that was a week ago. Now what Mr. Carney has is all those same problems. And he now has an MP that his party recruited, that plucked from the grasp of the conservative leadership and gave him that trip to Beijing, and they've been touting him. He's been in the pictures. He's been a liberal success story, and he is now casting doubts on whether or not China uses forced labors in its oppressed Muslim religious minority.
It's not a great look. It's
Good
not.
luck, Mr. Carney.
Good luck. Good luck with that, Mr. Carney. And also, by the way, because his minority is so thin, he can't just expel Ma from caucus, which on more normal times, he probably would have and could have. Right? So this is all getting tricky. This is all getting so tricky, Matt.
The other tricky part of it is they've given the conservatives all the opportunity they need to take their revenge on Ma.
Oh yeah. Oh, and they will. They're gonna ride this pony for weeks. Weeks.
Liberal MP Ma is the new conservative chew toy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's why I was saying at the very beginning, conservatives are having a good Friday.
Conservatives are having such a good Friday.
They might not feel that way right now, but they're having a pretty good Friday because
we'll see if who knows if they can actually capitalize on it. I don't have enormous amounts of faith.
There is that.
There is that. Yeah, so this is, can I just say once again, maybe this is blame shifting a little bit, but I don't love that the Americans have put us into this position. I'm really kind of upset about it. This isn't great. This isn't great. Like, hey, subject yourself to us and become our vassal state, or you're the big bad because you're aligning yourself with other big bads.
It's not blame shifting because the blame is correctly aimed. We are in this situation because the Americans put us in it. But
and we put ourselves in it too. Like, 20 years,
we've done 20 ourselves
years
no
of
favors.
To weakening ourselves for 20 years also put us in this. So like the blame is correctly allocated to ourselves first and foremost. And maybe to the Americans second. I mean, I said, I don't think that the Indians or the Chinese are the good guys in this particular scenario. No one's wearing white hats or black hats. But I understand their motivation. Their motivations are straightforward and clear. Like, I understand what the Chinese get out of us.
I want to tell you a story, and I'm going to have to tell it carefully because it's more of a personal story than normal, but I promise it's going to go somewhere and it's going to be funny.
Okay.
So when I was a young man, before I was married, I knew a young lady. And this young lady had gotten herself into trouble. And I was her friend, and she had come to me to ask for help. And I was listening to her describe her situation. And a younger version of me was not as polished and charming as the Matt Gurney you all know today. And I was concluding when I was listening to her that even though she had been treated badly, and she had been, she had also completely created the circumstances that allowed it to occur. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking, how do I explain this to her in a way that leaves her feeling validated and better for it? And then I just kind of went, well, fuck it. I'll just tell her bluntly.
Great. How'd that go? How'd that work for you?
Not the best, but I kind of feel like Canada needs that kind of a conversation. We have a bad boyfriend right now, but we kind of made this possible. Like, one of my rules of
we didn't deal with our childhood trauma. You
You
know?
cannot expect people to treat you better than you insist they treat you. Like, we all get to set the floor of what we're prepared to tolerate. And people may disappoint us, but then it's on us to do something about it.
Yeah.
And this young lady, whom I no longer speak to, and became a real estate agent in the Greater Toronto area, which means every once in a while I'll be driving down the street and her face will drive by me on the side of a bus, which is a strange experience to have. But I think she got it together because she kind of realized, yeah, you know what? Yeah, I'm not setting a standard of how I want to be treated by the world. Canada, girl, you've got to set a standard of how you insist you be treated. And we haven't done that. I'm going to pivot away from awkward seeing girls' face on billboards thing. You know what I saw this week that made me think about it? Headline, I think it was in CBC, maybe it was the Star, Canada hits 2% defense target. And then I just went back a couple of years and I found the Globe and Mail headline. Trudeau tells NATO Canada will never hit 2% defense target. And I just clipped them and I tweeted them both.
Yeah.
We made stupid decisions.
We made stupid decisions for a really long time. And do you want to know what makes me so
Posted of them.
And do you want to know what makes me so upset about all of this and all of our stupid decisions that we made for such a long time? Is that, and I mean, Matt, you and I have been talking about this for a really long time. So I like for years and years, you've been talking about our defense spending commitments and the fact that it's absolutely ridiculous that we're not living up to the commitments we agreed to. You and I have been talking. I mean, I've testified at multiple House and Senate committees about digital policy and the way that we're going about trying to specifically fund newspapers by fiddling with our digital policy was disastrous and doomed to blow back in our faces.
Yeah.
Apparently, I'm being asked to be a stakeholder on that conversation yet again. Yay. Let me tell you, being asked to be a stakeholder in that conversation is a little like being constantly recast in a Harry Potter remake that doesn't need to be made. You know what I mean? It's just like, except in this version, like a very kindly, well-intentioned Voldemort always wins. So I'm like a bit character that just keeps like, just let me die. Let me die. I swear to God.
Look, every once in a while in life, you come up with a situation where you're like, well, you deserve something, but that might have been a little overkill. And I haven't decided yet if what Canada's getting from the US is overkill or if it's an appropriate counter-reaction to the way we have treated ourselves and our allies. Because this is one of the things I don't think Canadians have wanted to have an honest reckoning with. We've let our allies down. We haven't been carrying our weight. We haven't lived up to our pledges. We haven't lived up to what we've said we would do. And then Trudeau flies to Europe and tells them we never will.
I'll note that Tim Hodgson today was basically saying the allies were coming to us talking about how they really want our natural gas. The natural gas that apparently there was no business case for a couple of years ago.
Is there a quick, short, snappy little way to describe a scenario in which there is an economic incentive to export a product because there are customers willing to purchase it? Something like business case?
Which, by the way, there was, because Tourmaline did sign a deal with the Germans for I forget how many barrels of natural gas, but essentially all that gas is now going through Louisiana. Mm-hmm. This is the stuff we've done to ourselves. We've done this to ourselves.
Oh, and then it's not just. I mean, here we're sliding fully, Jen,
which only makes the betrayal worse. By the way,
only makes the betrayal worse. There's just so many great stories this week that speaks to the point, because my other favorite one was the AG report that comes out and basically confirms just how much of a dumpster fire our immigration system became over the last decade. Mm-hmm. And the guys who were 100% responsible for overseeing it when it was happening are still senior ministers.
Yeah.
And they're going, well, with hindsight, what this country needs more than anything else is some form of accountability mechanism that makes people afraid. And the only one we seem to have right now is Donald Trump.
Oh, God help us. We're so doomed. Anyway, no, we're not doomed. We're fine. Everything's great. There was another little, there was another little side note. It was Paul Vieira from the Wall Street Journal retweeted this. It was a very obscure, I'm sure you've heard about it. It was something about Canadian rifles Like there was
specifically.
Yeah, it was like the Canadian Army had purchased a bunch of rifles, but something had screwed up, and like that there was no transparency or accountability mechanism for how the thing had screwed up.
Oh,
I know
it could
I
be
know
the
this is going to
rifles
sound
for
like
the
an
Rangers,
evergreen
which
to
are
you. That could be
cracking
any
already.
number of things. Sorry, what was that?
Well, it could be, yeah. I mean, I don't know which specific story you're talking about, but the Canadian Rangers were recently issued with new rifles, and they're already cracking, and they were supposed to have like decades of service life, but they're falling apart already.
Right. And that's basically if you read this thread, it just the lack of openness and transparency about what went wrong and why. And I don't mean to rehash this particular despair point, but there is no transparency mechanism in Canadian politics. There's no openness. There's no accountability. No one gets punished. Nothing changes. Like after the trucker this is why you and I love inquiries and commissions so much, because it's the only time any of us get any information about how government works ever. Mm-hmm. And let's say after the trucker inquiry, there was the commission that took place to figure out, like, well, what did Canadian police services and intelligence services do wrong to allow essentially the entire country to get shut down, and some of its border crossings to get shut down by angry truckers and protesters. And you started to realize, like, there was no communication mechanism between different departments. Everything was so utterly siloed that nobody was really talking to each other. And intelligence briefings were going into binders, and the binders were being sent up, and nobody was getting briefed on what was in the binders. And it was just, the entire thing had shut down. Matt, do you think that anything has been learned or improved since that inquiry? Do you have any faith that anyone was held to account? That anything got better? That any lessons were ever learned?
I expect that there would be marginal improvements at the edges, because people who go through things will learn lessons, but in a way that would change the institutional trajectories. No, if anything, it's getting worse. Like, I think what people don't understand right now, and I'm not trying to say this in a doomer way or a catastrophizing way, but I think a lot of our institutions right now are on a course toward further dysfunction, and it will require significant intervention, deliberate intervention, to reset them to neutrality of things will not get worse. And then it will require further still effort to actually start getting them better. But the drift in recent years has inertia. Look, as you know, and this is not what this podcast is about, but as you know, my family and I are in the middle of a healthcare emergency. And the amount of effort, Jen, it would take to reset the system to stability is astonishing. I look at our immigration stats. I look at our crime issues. I look at the military. Just this week, to replace the federal payroll system that we've been talking about replacing for years at a cost of billions is going to require billions more and further additional years. Like, we have to get the ship, like, just to stop sinking. Like, we have to get the pumps running enough so that it will equal the amount of water that is currently sloshing over the side. Then we can start bailing it out. And I actually, like, I've made this point many, many times before. I think Carney gets it. I think he understands in a big picture strategic sense that this is a government that has been kind of running itself for so long in pursuit of its own incentives. You know, that old joke I've shared with you, right? The bureaucracy is expanding to meet the needs of the expanding bureaucracy. Like, if you leave these things alone, they grow and they become weird. And then the column you wrote this week, I think, is perfect. The adult toy room, right? Yeah. Just this notion of this is what happens when you leave these people unsupervised.
The city of Calgary put an adult toy room.
To be clear, we don't mean sex toys. We mean normal toys for use by adults.
Normal toys, coloring books, stress balls, slinkies, fidget poppers, those sorts of things, to help adult city council members and staff cope with the stress of a blanket rezoning hearing. Like, that is what we have. That is the level of infantilization that we have normalized culturally. And even now, there are people in my Twitter feed and my inbox saying, well, that was nice. That was a nice thing for them to do. look, the Americans are going to eat us alive. That's actually where my fears are right now. And that doesn't make them good guys. That doesn't make them noble people, okay? That doesn't make them living up to their own ideals to eat the weaker people alive. But we're the ones who made ourselves the morsel. We did that to ourselves. And we're continuing to do that to ourselves a year into this. My frustration is palpable, Matt. My frustration is despair. And yes, it is March. So one cannot trust that my feelings will be maintained on this issue indefinitely.
I'll unmute myself. That helps. Years and years ago, I watched a dog eat an entire chicken wing that had fallen, and it just snapped it right out of the air and swallowed it. And chicken wings are kind of notorious for being like dog killers.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing just went gulp, and then it wanted more. That's what the Americans are going to do to us.
And look, and they may choke on it. They may choke on us, okay? We may in fact be the chicken wing. We may be the chicken wing of the alliance, but we are a chicken wing on the floor right now, everybody.
We know a chicken wing in midair spiraling in an arc from the counter towards the kitchen floor, and the dog is just perfectly positioned to do what dogs do and go, hey, airborne chicken wing.
The dog's gonna do what the dog's gonna do. We need it to be at least a chicken. You know?
So
chickens can run.
One of the things I wrote a column for the Star this week, where this was a very local story, so it wouldn't have been of an interest to the line. But years and years and years ago, there was a park in Toronto where the side, like the park was kind of like below the roadbed level, and then there was the sidewalk here, and then to get to the park you kind of had to walk down, and there was a ramp. You could walk around the long way and do it, but people were always doing the dumb thing they do where they're creating their own path, and it was just turning very slick and steep. And this local guy asked the city of Toronto, can you please put in some stairs at the park? And the city of Toronto said, well, we looked at it, but based on the usage of the park and the estimated cost of installing the concrete stairs would be $150,000. We decided not to do it. So the guy went out, he spent $550 on lumber. He hired a homeless guy, and he built a flight of wooden stairs in one day, and they were great. And the city of Toronto then showed up with a work crew to dismantle the stairs because they didn't meet code. And once the media found out about this, the city got freaked out because it was humiliating, and they immediately built the concrete stairs, and it only cost $10,000. So the accountability mechanism in Toronto almost a decade ago was one guy with some tools and some lumber. Right now, the Canadian federal government's only accountability mechanism is the United States.
Well, no, wait, the accountability mechanism also was the media that humiliated the city, but the media that can do that has also been severely damaged. So those accountability mechanisms are no longer in case. You and I can scream to high heaven about what the Ontario government is going to do to neuter access to information, right? But no one cares anymore.
The voters will not care.
The voters won't care. So like the accountability mechanisms have broken down across the chain, and now politicians can hide whatever they want and basically do whatever they want, and they will never be fired, and they'll never be voted out. And the paradox of all of this is, well, the Americans can hold us to account on certain issues, and my God, please do. At the same time, the more they try to hold us to account, the more the voters will clench up and continue to vote for the status quo. So we're in a non-virtuous cycle right now, and it's bad. And I have sad feelings.
I need Trumps to do nothing but suit Truth Social about how bad the potholes are in Toronto.
Yes.
Like, we would fix them so fucking fast.
I need Marco Rubio talking about the damage that will be done if Canada expands MAID access or euthanasia access to the mentally ill. Like, can we get some help over there? That'd be great.
The U.S. consulate in Toronto takes a couple of rounds, and all of a sudden the city of Toronto police service are suddenly taking extremist violence very seriously. I don't know if you saw this, but like they announced a new like zero tolerance strategy. They've blocked protests from marching through Jewish neighborhoods. Armed police patrols are being stepped up around Jewish cultural and religious sites. All the fucking stuff I've been demanding for 2.5 years happens 2 weeks after the U.S. consulate takes around. The United States is our only accountability mechanism.
And that's not great. That's not great.
No, it's suboptimal.
It's suboptimal, because we're going to talk more about the United States in our third section. But first, we're going to talk a little bit about the Francophone blow-up and what I think is really happening here. If you haven't already, do check us out, www.readtheline.ca. Like and subscribe. So, Matt, can you set us up on this? Quebec is very upset. Quebec is upset.
Yeah. I always, whenever we talk about Quebec, it's kind of like we don't get censured by the National Assembly. We haven't done our job
yet. I'm aiming for it. If I can get censured by the National Assembly, that would be legend here. That would be the point at which I could leave journalism with my head held high.
A couple of days ago, I was getting on an Air Canada flight to fly back from the United States. And it was in the morning, and the news broke that overnight there had been a tragic accident at LaGuardia in New York. I don't want to get ahead of the investigation there, but for some reason, emergency vehicles at LaGuardia had been dispatched to aid a plane that was in distress. And one of them drove across a runway where an Air Canada jet was landing, and the Air Canada jet unfortunately collided with the fire truck. Both the pilots on the Air Canada jet were killed. Obviously something tragic, many other people injured as well. We have nothing to say about that from a commentary perspective, other than that it was heartbreaking. By the time I was back home in Toronto later that day, safe and sound, the CEO of Air Canada had released a statement on social media. And let me confess something to you. I watched the whole statement. Thought it was a good statement. And I also thought to myself, this guy's going to get roasted for half of it not being in French. And the fact that that is now built into my understanding of how this country works, I'm not expressing an opinion on whether or not the guy should have done half the statement in French. I believe that the flight crew was French Canadian, so it obviously would have been ideal. But I just thought to myself, I've lived in this country long enough that 2 pilots are dead and dozens are injured and families are bereaved. And I'm thinking about, did he stick the language balance? Because that's the kind of country I live in. And turns out he didn't. And Quebec is angry, and the Prime Minister is disappointed, and he said as much. I've talked to some friends who live in Quebec, and apparently this is a big deal in Quebec. Like, it's being talked about a lot. It's on the talk radio. It's on the newspapers. It's a talker, as we would say in the biz. And I just sigh really heavily because 2 pilots are dead.
Wasn't the CEO actually called to Parliament to account for his lack of French? And I also say, my understanding is that, pardon?
I think, yeah, I mean, I don't recall the specifics of that, but his lack of French language skills has been identified as an issue in the past. It's been something that's been awkward for the government and for Air Canada. Despite
the fact that the CEO position of Air Canada isn't required to be a bilingual position. Like, there's an understanding that you actually, if you were to require a bilingual CEO, that would effectively hugely diminish the talent pool from which CEO the airline could pull from. So like that is not a bilingual required position.
We can't require it, but we'll shame you.
Well, exactly, right? It's not required, but if you can't stand up in front of a camera during a moment of extremely high stress and deliver a polished bilingual statement, then you get called to Parliament to account for your lack of French language skills. It's not that hard after all. So, okay, so here's the thing. Normally, I could be relied upon to do the whole Alberta, Canada. Canada is not actually a bilingual country, and the overwhelming amount of data shows that 95% of people, even people who are raised in French immersion classes, for example, do not retain the language unless they are regularly exposed to it. You can't force bilingualism on a country from the government top down. It doesn't work. We've demonstrated that it doesn't work. The only people who are effectively bilingual are the very small percentage of people who have an extraordinary wiring for language, or people who live and work in places that are bilingual. And if you do not live and work in places in bilingual, which, by the way, is the majority of the country, it's almost impossible to effectively retain the language, much less feel comfortable going up in public and delivering a statement in French, right? And the fact that we operate under this delusion that we're a bilingual country and that the failure of Anglos to learn French, even though they're not regularly exposed to French, is some kind of moral failing or intellectual failing, has the effect of making sure that a huge chunk of the federal civil service and certain types of high-profile, high-leverage jobs are limited to people of a very specific geographic and class, a very specific geography and class, okay? And that operates to the detriment of the country as a whole, right? Whenever, and that's not a disrespect to people of French-Canadian descent at all, quite the opposite. What it is an observation is that when you confine your talent pool to a very narrow look, if we were to say that everybody in the federal service had to come from Alberta, the inevitable consequence of that is that you would be pulling your talent from a very narrow talent pool just by virtue of the math, right? And it would mean that certain people from the rest of the country would feel chronically alienated and misrepresented or underrepresented in the institutions of the country. That's the effect. And that's why I think Anglos get so eye-rolly about this stuff and so frustrated about this stuff. Because we have already created a country that disproportionately benefits bilingual Canadians to the actual detriment of unilingual Anglos who don't feel represented in this country's institutions and who are alienated from this country's institutions, by virtue of the fact that those Anglos just don't happen to live in places that are bilingual, that are effectively not bilingual. It's just what it is. Alberta, outside of a couple of pockets here, is not a bilingual province. Saskatchewan, I think there are more Cree language speakers than French speakers in Saskatchewan, last I checked. I was raised in BC. Punjabi was a more common language than French in British Columbia. All right, so outside of a very narrow triangle of this country is not a French bilingual country, and that is a fiction that we operate within. Look, I said I wasn't going to do the predictable Alberta, Canada thing, and I'm already 5 minutes into this rant. Okay.
Jen's already separated.
Sorry. I wasn't going to go into this rant. The reason why I wasn't going to go into this rant is because I think a more interesting thing is going on here than the usual tension between the Anglos and the French and the bilingual, okay? What I think is actually happening here is that the world is on fire. We are increasingly not able to do anything about that as a country. We are under a kind of existential threat from our largest trading partner, neighbor, and ostensibly friend. Our capacity to react to that is proving to be strikingly limited.
Yep.
And in the face of a radical amount of change that we increasingly don't have sovereignty or control over, we're defaulting to stuff that feels familiar. And controversies about the French language and Air Canada, especially because Air Canada sucks, that is very safe and familiar for us. So we are going to over-index to the types of controversies and the types of so-called talkers that give us the illusion of feeling like we're under control of our shit. That's what I actually think is happening here.
I think you're right.
Okay.
While you were talking there, I grabbed my phone and I quickly pulled up City of Toronto data. About a third of the City of Toronto does not speak English as their language at home. The top 5 languages are broken down. I'm not going to tell you what they are. I'll tell you that French isn't one of them.
We're increasingly a multilingual country, and I think it benefits a lot of us to speak other languages. Don't get me wrong, I'm a big fan of speaking other languages. I think that's great.
I think so too.
But when I was in BC, do you want to know the other languages we had the option to learn? We had the option to learn French, Spanish, and Japanese. Those were our options in high school.
I don't remember what our options were. I think it was French and Italian. I took neither. I stopped as quick as I could. And my wife's fluently bilingual, French and English. And
some people have that skill, man. It's great.
yeah, no, I've envied it. Like in recent years, I've worked really, really hard to learn Spanish, and I'm not fluent. I can function.
And you and I aren't dumb, and we're not morally suspect. And well, some people might say, but I mean, we're not. It's not that we don't mean well. It's just the overwhelming amount of data that we have on this shows that language acquisition skills occur best in environments where they are maintained naturally, not on apps or classes.
Yep.
Right? If you're not regularly exposed to the language, you're going to lose it. When I was living in the Middle East, I learned a little bit of Arabic, and I can still kind of read a little bit of Arabic and a little bit of Hebrew. I'm not fluent. I can't speak it because I'm not constantly exposed to Arabic. Right? It's just what it is.
What happens to me now is you put me in a place where a lot of Spanish is being spoken, and after a week or two, I'll be up to speed, but I come home to Toronto and I just start losing it.
And you lose it. That's exactly right. So that's a normal human brain. That's how language acquisition skills happen for the majority of us, unless you have a weirdo special wiring like my husband does, where he can just pick up languages and keep them. But he is not the norm on many different standards. He married me. That was your first evidence. That was your first clue. Anyway, look, I don't want to overemphasize this point, but I don't want to get lost in the bilingualism debate, because that is a 40-year debate in this country that will never be resolved. I think it's just important to note it because, as I said, we're hyper fixating on the types of controversies that feel familiar in a world that increasingly feels out of control.
Yeah, and I think, look, our friends with any background in psychology or social work would know that people who feel out of control often obsess over small things they think that they can control.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm looking at a country where we are having another language kerfuffle.
This is very serious. This is what we need to be. It's a coping mechanism. It's a coping mechanism. That's what I think it is.
And we're going to get in trouble for denying the importance of the French language. If the people of Quebec in their wisdom honestly believe that this is the issue that is the most pressing thing on their plate right now, then I hope they forgive me for saying this in English, but I cannot tell them how much I envy them. Like and subscribe.
Matt, you and I started off this podcast by noting that both Pierre Poilievre and I went to the United States this week or last week. Last week. One of us got invited to a podcast, and one of us got invited to the White House, and it was not who you.
Well, I was in the States and I'm coming too. I got invited to neither. Okay, so hey, I got nothing.
So Pierre Poilievre did the Joe Rogan podcast, and let's talk about that first because that is actually the more important of the two. And I technically got invited to do a West Wing tour, although I did not get to meet anybody particularly important while I was doing it. So
all the people who met Jen in the West Wing last week are like, "What the fuck, Jen?"
Exactly.
Look, okay, Poilievre goes on Rogan. I didn't listen. I don't care. I've listened to a few Rogan episodes. Rogan is way better at interviewing than people give him credit for. He is a natural talent at it. He's not a journalist. And not every recorded format is intended to be journalism. And I get weirded out when people talk about, well, that's not journalism. Rogan is entertainment that overlaps with journalism because he gets really interesting people on to talk about really interesting things. But he's not a journalist.
No, he's journaltainment, man.
Yeah.
And I think that you could, and I think you could make some critiques about the types of people he's choosing to platform and whether or not he has a disproportionate responsibility to challenge some of the people he's platforming, given that that he has such a large audience. I think that's a legitimate conversation and not one I particularly care to weigh in on right now. But I also don't hold him to journalistic standards because he's not pretending to be that. I think he's a better interviewer than he is a comedian, but that's a whole other conversation. Look, I think that Pierre Poilievre did very well on Joe Rogan. I think he hit the tone really effectively. Once again, it's like if that Pierre Poilievre had been the guy who ran in the last election, the Conservatives would have done a lot better. I thought he was strong on trade. I think he was strong on Canada 51st State stuff. I think he was strong on oil sand stuff. I think he was strong on social policy. And I think he came across as kind of a likable dork. This is the Pierre Poilievre that we know to be true. Like the dorky Poilievre who's really into kettlebells. You know what I mean? Look, I am not the Joe Rogan audience. But I think he actually did the country some good on that podcast. He presented us well, and he put us on the radar among the sorts of people who we need to be on the radar on. If I have two very minor critiques, it's that one, he should have done that podcast during the election. I think that not doing that podcast during the election was an error. And I know that there are lots of conservatives who'd be like, yeah, but then you would have said that he was Trump-like. And I'm like, no, if that Pierre Poilievre did that Joe Rogan podcast during the election, no one could have credibly called him Trump-like. Come on now. Secondly, it's interesting to me that he gets invited on Rogan as I think is hitting its decline. I think that Rogan's kind of hitting near the end of its cultural influence.
That's interesting. Okay.
I think Rogan's kind of starting to peter out a little bit as being the guy. That's just an intuitive thing. I don't know.
Yeah, I have no opinion on that whatsoever. I think that's interesting. Why do you think that is?
I think that the MAGA movement's shifting. I think the MAGA movement's internally splitting, and I think it's shifting, and I think it's going to reform into something else. Especially as I think that Donald Trump is increasingly demonstrably not fit to bear that particular banner. So like Rogan is going to be like everybody, all empires die, right? Mm-hmm. Everybody has their peak moment, and then their moment begins to fade. I just have a feeling that Joe Rogan's shtick is a little bit on the fadey side as opposed to the growy side.
It's really
gut feeling.
No, it's really interesting you mentioned that, because I was in the States too, and trying my hardest not to talk politics. I was not there for that. But one of the things I picked up on, I was in Florida, and I had been in Florida a couple of years ago. The Florida I was in a couple of years ago was hyper political. I've been in Florida 3 times in the last 4 years, and both times I was there, hyper political. Couldn't go anywhere without hearing about politics. I heard about politics out in the open once in 10 days, and all I heard expressed was complete exasperation. And it was literally me. It's just a very domestic scene. I went up to, well, not domestic, but very folksy. I went up to a bar to pay the tab because that's where the machine was, and the handheld unit wasn't working. And rather than make this poor girl who was clearly stressed out figure out how to do it, I just said, hey, I'll come with you. I'll bring the bill. I'll go up to the bar. I'll pay it right there. And while I'm standing at the bar, there was 2 guys, an older guy and a younger guy, talking politics. And they were both just saying, gas is through the roof. I don't know what we're doing in Iran. I just sick of it all. And the guy went, amen, brother. That was the extent of the politics I heard discussed in a state where normally you cannot avoid it. And yeah, I think one of the senses I've had also just talking with Americans lately, I think, Jen, you put your finger on it. We're stuck with Trump for a while. But I think, yeah, I got annoyed with a state senator recently. I sent him a snarky tweet, which I'm sure he was very upset. Must have cut him right to the quick.
The foreigners get them deep, I know.
And it was you probably saw the story a few days ago where right before the U.S. began bombing Iran. No, it was right before Trump announced 5 days of not taking out Iran's power plants. Minutes before that, there were a bunch of very large market moves by betting accounts or trading accounts that had just been opened. Obviously, there's some insider trading going on here. And I'm not saying it's Mr. Trump. It could be someone leaking in his administration.
Staff. There's tons of stuff.
Clearly, there's people who are exploiting geopolitics to make fortunes. And the state senator was all in high dudgeon. This is not normal. We cannot normalize this. And I'm just thinking to myself, dude, I don't want to be that guy. I don't want to be the Canadian tourist who has to explain something to you. But the ability to shock and horrify the American population by pointing out things that Mr. Trump or his administration are doing is zero. The Americans are already thinking beyond it. I can tell you that the Americans are not going to spend the next 3 years being shocked and horrified or even excited and supportive about what Mr. Trump is doing, because God bless the Americans, they are already thinking about the next one. That's where their minds are. They are thinking about 2028 or even the midterms that are coming up later this year. Mr. Trump is already a sideshow. He can do a lot of damage or even good, but he's no longer going to drive the agenda. And that's why I thought it was so interesting to hear you say that about Rogan. I don't pay enough attention to Rogan to know, but if that fits with the broader shift in Americans of already kind of assuming, yeah, okay, well, we're stuck with this guy for 3 more years, but whatever, that could fit.
So I'll circle back to Pierre Poilievre once again. I think that Pierre did a good job, and he did what he needed to do in that podcast. And to me, it also highlighted one thing. One, he should have done that during the election. I just believe that. Secondly, it also highlighted to me the folly of this Pierre does no media strategy, or Pierre only does Pierre's good on media. He's good at these interviews. The only critique that I have for him is that he continually is doing these friendly interviews. He's kind of avoiding harder interviews, harder interviewers. And I think that it's such a lost, I'm making a pitch for myself and for you here. It's a lost opportunity for him. Like, he can come on the line, or he can come on some really hard, really informed interviewers, and he can, because he would be going up against a genuine adversary or a genuine tough get, his opportunities to do well would be so much higher. And I mean, like tough interviews are such a high reward, high risk, high reward scenario, but he's got the skills to be able to make that high reward for himself. And it just seems to me like, once again, you're losing. He can do this. He's really good at this. And when he comes across as his most authentic, dorky policy self, he's actually kind of charmingly likable in a weird way. When he tries to do the condescending, apple-bitey version of himself, I think he's actually he's most likable among the people whom he's attacking, but he's least likable among the people outside of that base. And he's got the skills to do that. He's got the policy chops to be a really, really good interview.
He's a good enough communicator.
He's a good communicator. And trying to hide him from hard interviews, I think, doesn't serve him. And I don't think it serves the Conservatives or the Conservative Party. I want to talk about the White House, though, because we're talking about Americans.
Yeah, let me make one final point about Poilievre, and it'll just take me a second to do it. I agree with everything. I agree with you. He's about all of that. I also think it's really interesting because I did see him take some criticism, not exactly what you were saying, but similar to it, basically along the lines of, but Rogan doesn't know enough about Canada to really hold him to account or call him out on stuff. No, that's true. But Jon Stewart didn't know enough to hold Carney to account when Carney launched. Trudeau's last big foreign interview before leaving was Colbert. These are safe spaces for Canadian politicians to go out and sketch a version that will not be challenged, but which will be voraciously consumed by Canadian audiences. Poilievre did not go on Rogan to talk to Americans. I think he did, and that'll have some benefit, potentially. But he went on Rogan to show Canadians how he would talk to Americans. It's subtle, but that's a real difference.
That's a really good point. Okay. I got to visit the White House, Matt. Cool. I went to Washington last week.
It was pretty cool. I've never been to the White House. That's really cool.
It's pretty cool. Cool and also terrifying, but cool. So my husband has been working in and out of Washington for like 15 years now, and I have never been to Washington because we got married, we had children, and we moved into this pattern that I think a lot of couples with young children run into, where I go out or he goes out. The babysitters are too expensive, right? So when he travels, and then I travel for work. So we both travel. He travels way more than I do, which is, I think, good for both of us. But he's in Washington more times than he can count, and all he tells me are these stories of Washington and going to the Capitol Grill and doing the new bar or whatever, and I'm like. Like, it was time. You're living an exciting life while I'm taking care of the kids back in suburban Calgary. I don't love this. So finally, the kids are old enough. He got invited to do a presentation in Washington, and I was like, "Screw you, buddy! You're taking me with you." Grandma, I'm calling a favor from Grandma. I'm coming with you to DC. And he was kind of really excited about that because all of a sudden he could show me his DC.
Yeah.
And I had the opportunity to see all the tourist sites and just be, the DC tourist swamp monster. So I was like, this is cool. I can go to the Smithsonian, like total nerd, right? Really cool. I'm a very cool human being. You have no idea. But as a result of this, he managed to ask some people who he knew in DC if we could get a West Wing tour. He had never been in the West Wing himself. But of course, we've got contacts, and it's actually quite hard to get a West Wing tour now. Mm-hmm. You kind of have to know someone who knows someone, and we knew someone who knew someone. So I'm going to tell you about my West Wing tour.
Do it.
Which was really cool, by the way. So we had to pull up. It happened at night because, of course, you can't go during the day because during the day it's an active office. I think Donald Trump was in residence, but of course we didn't go into the residence because you can't do that. And of course the East Wing doesn't exist anymore. It's great. So we only got to see the West Wing side. And so you go in and you can take pictures outside, but the second you go in, you have to put in your phones and lock them up because you can't take any photos inside. So we were like, well, it's kind of sad, but okay, cool. So we go in, and the first thing we saw was like there was the vice president's wing. And the other thing you start to realize or is explained to you is that the president and the vice president in his hallway, they all get to control or put up photographs throughout all the hallways, right? And usually the photographs are images of stuff they've done in office, people they've met, just really cool images. They've got professional photographers. And so they're constantly, it's almost like the entire West Wing is like a rotating gallery wall of the administration's time in office. And so we're walking around and like, okay, that's pretty cool. And because I've never done a West Wing tour, I can't compare this to what it was during Biden or Obama or previous presidents. This is the first time I've been in there, so I have no baseline of normal. But there's a couple things I'm really noticing about the pictures that are being put on the wall here. One, there are a lot of pictures of the Saudis, like Mohammed bin Salman and Saudi trips, like a lot, not just one, but like there's a disproportionately high picture of Gulf state leaders here in the West Wing. So I'm like, that might be, a reflection of people who are coming to visit at that particular moment. There were some pictures, for example, of the Japanese prime minister who was about to visit. So I think she just visited as well. So, and there were also quite a few pictures of like King Charles and also the Brits, that the pageantry of the Brits were there in quite high proportion.
I believe the king's on his way to Washington shortly.
Yeah. So this all makes sense. Kind of. The disproportionate Gulf state leader stuff was a lot. And almost all the pictures had Donald Trump himself very prominently featured. So what you would expect from a sort of narcissistic personality, there's a lot of Donald Trump in them. But okay, that didn't surprise me. That was nothing new. What was really interesting was the lack of very many pictures of allies. I found one picture of Mark Carney, and it was a picture in which like Trump was doing a photo lineup with a bunch of other world leaders. Carney was at the end. Trump looked miserable, and the photo was like in the back of a hallway. Like it was very prominently not displayed. Like I don't recall any pictures of Macron or Merz or anybody like that. Like it was the and I'm sure there were some there. Like it's not like I was obsessively cataloging this, but the disproportionate number of pictures that were featuring Gulf state leaders and the extraordinarily comparable lack of allies on the walls, interesting. And also interesting because it was a choice. The other thing that was explained to me was like usually these pictures are put on the wall. They have black frames. Of course, Donald Trump had to have gold frames. All the frames were gold, of course. And then as you kind of go further along into the White House, first there's a couple things you start to realize. One is it's much smaller than than it should be. Like you're used to seeing like pictures of the Oval Office, and it makes it seem like this is a really large, expansive office space. It really isn't. It's quite intimate. So we got to see like the Situation Room, but we didn't, of course, get to go into the Situation Room. It was like there were ropes. Be like, yeah, you definitely don't get to go into the Situation Room. You don't be ridiculous. But we got to like see that there was a door to the Situation Room, and that's actually shockingly close to everything else, right? As we kept going through this hallway, we started to notice that certain rooms had been aggressively decorated with the gold finials. Again, this has been reported and pictured in news media. To actually see it in person was quite alarming and striking, and I'm going to explain why in a minute. Then near the end of the tour, we got to see the Presidential Hall of Fame, which was right off of the Rose Garden, right? Again, much, much closer together than you picture it in your brain. The Presidential Hall of Fame, and this is why I want to be like respectful, because on one hand, it's very cool to get a White House tour and it's a real honor. And favors were called in order to give us this opportunity. It was really neat. Like, that's a once in a lifetime opportunity to be able to do that. And then you go into this space and I saw the Presidential Hall of Fame, which we knew was going to be there because, of course, it's been reported on. What's happened is, Donald Trump has taken all of the pictures of all the presidents, and then he's put these plaques underneath all of them. And I'm not going to read the plaques to you because you can go and Google them yourself. They've been extensively recorded. But these plaques are fucking ripshit insane. And every single president has like a Truth Social post about Donald Trump's personal opinions and grievances against him. The picture where Joe Biden is supposed to be isn't a picture of Joe Biden. It's a picture of Joe Biden's auto pen, right down to the petty, like where the name plaque should be. It's like auto pen and then the dates of his service. And it wasn't just like he could just contain his ire to one plaque. Like the recent presidents get two plaques to explain all the reasons why Donald Trump hates him. And we could only go so far as, I think it was Wilson, before the rope kind of cut us off. But it became pretty obvious that like Donald's written one of these little plaques for all of the presidents. And he's put like a big gold Hall of Fame with more of the fake gold finials around. And this was the moment when I looked at this and I actually felt dizzy, because it was pretty clear that among the people who were doing this tour who were MAGA, this was super funny. This was a super funny troll. And as someone who isn't steeped in that culture and was visiting this as a foreign national, this was very clearly ripshit insane and demonstrated a total lack of restraint. It just demonstrated that what's happening here is exactly what it appears to be. There's no adult in the room to say no to this guy. Like, there's nobody even thinking about how this looks or the way this comes across anymore. Same thing when I went into the kind of the Oval Office, which was, again, so cool to see this historic space that I'd only ever seen in pictures before. And yet every single surface is what appears to be, or what we know, or we have reason to believe to know, is essentially spray painted styrofoam finials on everything. And no care or regard for what that visual what that visual aesthetic communicates to people who are visiting that space, right? The lack of restraint that demonstrates, the degree of unmitigated self-regard that demonstrates. And I guess it also kind of hit me really hard because, I've talked a little bit about this podcast about how I lived in the Gulf states for a couple of years. And especially when you look at older Gulf state buildings, many of which were, previously British, managed by Britain during the height of the colonial era. There's a very specific visual language that a lot of these buildings and palaces have. They adopt or used to adopt the aesthetic language of their essentially colonial rulers in order to convey colonial monarchical rulers in order to convey authority and power. So they adopted this kind of faux Versailles or this faux British monarchy type of aesthetic, and then they would plaster their own palaces with tons of marble, tons of glass, tons of gold finials, lavish silk curtains, images of the leaders in every office building. There was a historical antecedent that explained that visual language, and that was these guys were using the aesthetics of monarchical Europe, and then they were transplanting that into their modern spaces in order to convey authority and power.
And continuity.
Right?
Yep.
Continuity, exactly. That was the whole language. And like the Gulf states have actually kind of moved away from that. Like they actually have a much more interesting modern aesthetic language. And as they become wealthier and more powerful, they're developing their own aesthetic dialect, right? That is much more rooted in local culture and desert aesthetics. I'm using that word a lot. I'm sorry. Go look, for example, at the Louvre in Abu Dhabi, and you get a visual feel for this. It expresses grandeur and power and wealth in ways that aren't European, right? That have a kind of this sort of modern European influence, but are uniquely and distinctly of the time and place. So they're getting much better about developing their own visual language. Mm-hmm. But in the recent past, their visual language for conveying authority and power was very much rooted in a kind of pastiche of European monarchical norms, right? Yep. So I absorbed a lot of that. And when I went and visited the White House, I was like, oh, that's what they're doing. That's what this guy's doing. He's absorbing a pastiche of monarchical visual cues in order to display power and wealth. Mm-hmm. And to me, I guess it hit me really hard and really just in a really interesting way, because that is not American.
It wasn't American.
It's not American. Like, it's one thing when I walk into a legislature or a parliament and I see that language, right? Because our history and our culture is rooted in the history and culture of the Westminster parliamentary system. So it makes sense that we have wood-paneled walls and gold finials and symbolic references that harken back to that, right? That is part of our history. But it's not American. American has its own visual style and aesthetic that is very much not that, and in many ways is a rejection of that, an abject rejection of that.
Return more to Roman and Greek motifs.
Roman and Greek motifs, the Federalist styles, all of that kind of thing. And it's a much more minimal, not necessarily minimal exactly, but it looks different. And I'm not an expert in these sorts of things, so I can't explain this as well as I probably would. I'm trying to explain something that I understand intuitively, not necessarily intellectually. Mm-hmm. But one of the offices in the West Wing that wasn't changed was the Roosevelt Room. And the Roosevelt Room didn't have gold tats smattered all across of it. It had, like, classical pictures of American figures, and the walls were actually pretty simple, and like it was all elegant and well done, but a bit spare. And that is in keeping with the kind of values and norms that Americans sort of traditionally expressed in their government spaces. And what Donald Trump is doing in the spaces that he is controlling and decorating is expressing a contempt for those values and norms through his use of visual cues. And it was really weird. It was actually kind of uncomfortable. It was uncomfortable.
I would love one day to see the West Wing.
Yeah. I'd love to see it again. I'd love to see it again in the future.
Later.
Yeah. Later. After this time has passed.
I mentioned in one of our earlier segments getting a little annoyed on social media with a U.S. state senator. And I'm not annoyed with you, because everything you were just saying was fascinating. And you and I hadn't had a chance to talk about it. And I was curious to hear about your West Wing trip. But to me, I file all of that under, yeah. Mm-hmm. like when you're talking about what President Trump has done to the White House, how he views himself, how he views other countries in his orbit. Mm-hmm. Yep. And what you're describing, and I hope you don't think I'm being dismissive of that, because I'm sure it was a lot to see face to face. It must have been a very visceral dope.
Yeah, I'd seen the stories about this, but actually being in the space it's a different. You feel it in a different way.
Yeah. It's, to me, I mean, it's something you and I used to say tongue in cheek, but also literally, is that, like, this is what American voters chose. The Americans have a right to choose their own destiny, and they chose auto pen photos, snarky plaques, and gold trim.
And also he creates challenge coins. He's put giant challenge coins on all the doors. Like, there's one other thing I will observe here, and this is, again, just from walking around Washington. One of the things that I really liked about it, because, I'm rigid in my own perspective, is that they had almost all the official federal buildings have, like, the foundational liberal values, small L liberal values, literally carved in stone on the buildings. And I'm like, yes, good. I like foundations that are carved in stone. And then on top of these very same buildings, you increasingly are having these giant portraits of Donald Trump, like right on the Department of Justice. Like there's a huge banner of him on the Department of Justice. And there were other buildings like the Department of Labor, for example, that now had giant banners of Donald Trump and giant banners next to Roosevelt kind of thing. And I did overhear Americans point this out, like, that's batshit crazy. That's batshit fucking crazy. And it is. And it creates, again, if you're used to it and you're enmeshed in that culture, I'm sure you can get to a point where you don't see it anymore. But as someone who is, of course, foreigner and visiting as a tourist, the cognitive dissonance of seeing a giant picture of Donald Trump's face on the Department of Justice building where they have like all of these high-minded egalitarian values about, you know, no man being above justice. That's, woof, that did a thing to me, man. That did a thing to me.
A couple of podcasts ago, we talked about the U.S. ambassador to Canada. We should wrap it. We've been talking for a while, but we were talking about Ambassador Hextra, the U.S. ambassador to Canada. And one of the points I had made was I actually love the guy because he just lays it out. And the gold trim in the snarky plaques and the banners of his face hanging off of stuff. I appreciate this. I don't like it when bad guys are subtle. You know, I much prefer, not even bad guys. I'll say it more value neutrally than that. I like it when people are open and honest about who and what they are. And Mr. Trump is not a man who is subtle, and he does not leave much to the imagination, and he is not big on ambiguity. And I appreciate that. And that's why state senators prattling on and on and on, how we cannot allow this to be normalized. Dumbass, you're the problem. Every time I see some American going, fellow citizens of this great republic, how are you not appalled by the recent conduct of those who conduct power on your behalf? Fuck you. Get with the program. Like, I need the Americans to start fighting the battles they're in, not the ones they're trying to reconcile themselves with after binging their West Wing DVDs. America's changing. It's fine. Countries change. It'll change back. This is not America forever. It's America now. It'll be different in 2 years. I get it. But I had a lot of frustration with this, and I wrote that column a few months ago about the Halifax conference, of this certain segment of the American power structure, currently out of power because they were mostly Democrats. But these are the people who go from like government jobs when their party's in power, and then their party loses, and they go into academia and think tanks, but then 8 years later their guy wins again, boom, now they're ambassador to France or something like that. You know what I mean? Like the people who are high enough up in American civic life that they kind of alternate in and out of government roles. And these people were in such unbelievable denial. And it's just like, well, yeah, you know, well, we'll win the midterms, and then Europe will welcome us back, and the Canadians will heave a great sigh of relief. No, once you see the banner hanging off the side of the Justice Department, your error bars that you put around your probable American responses, they get bigger. And I love America. I wear my love for America on my sleeve. I love Americans. But they're doing some dumb stuff right now. And just like that girl I used to know who eventually became a real estate agent, somebody needs to be honest with them. Someone just needs to be honest with them about why these things are happening. And
well, to that note, when I said I noticed I was doing my last little tour, and there was a giant picture of Donald Trump's face on the Department of Labor, which I couldn't entirely reconcile, but there were Americans behind me, and they were looking at this, and they were like, that's nuts. That's completely insane. They can see that it's insane.
What are they going to do about it?
And then they continued to be in the marathon.
Oh, they were for a run?
Yeah, we were out there. There was a marathon happening, like this rock and roll marathon happening in DC. We were walking through, and they're like, I talk to so many Americans, and it seems like it's a frog and pot problem, right? And it's only when a weird little foreign tourist kind of gets thrown in and like, oh my God, this is really hot, guys. This is
water's
real hot, and then jumps back out again. But the people who are there and who lived in it are immiserated in it and have normalized it and also made it funny. It's just like, I think in a way, not in a funny way, I just mean like in a dark humor coping way. And I catch myself doing this because I use dark humor to cope a lot.
Same.
But the risk of dark humor is that you do wind up normalizing what isn't normal through the use of humor. And that kind of disempowers you in a weird way. I don't know. I need to think about this a little bit more. Anyway, that was my visit to Washington. It was interesting.
Fascinating. You know what?
It was fascinating.
Do you want to write a column about it?
I probably do want to write a column about it. I'm still stewing on it a little bit, but yeah, I probably should write a column about it.
In general, we have typically treated the podcast and columns as separate. Our dispatches and our podcast overlap a bit.
Mm-hmm.
But I think you've got material here for a column.
Okay.
Just my 2 cents.
All right.
Thank you, everybody. Check us out, readtheline.ca. Great to be back with the Line Podcast. We took last week off, and as you now know, because Jen and I were both down in the States for different reasons. But thanks. Check us out, like and subscribe. We'll talk with you soon. Have a great one.